75% of Venezuelans lost 19 pounds in a single year. Not from exercise, from hunger. In a country that was once wealthy enough to give away gasoline for less than the price of bottled water. Everyone says Venezuela collapsed because of the oil. That's a lie. Oil was always there. What disappeared was something else entirely, something that took decades to build and a few years to destroy. Stay until the end of this video and I'll show you the real autopsy report, the actual cause of death, and why it's a warning sign for every other country that thinks institutions don't matter. This isn't about Venezuela anymore, it's about what comes next. Part 1. The night. Everything snapped. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that a sitting head of state has been pulled out of a military compound in the middle of the night and flown 1,500 miles north to be locked up. That's what happened to Nicolas Maduro on January 3, 2026. The arrest wasn't spontaneous. It was tied to narco-terrorism indictments and a $50 million bounty that had been raised back in August 2025. $50 million. That's the price tag the United States government put on a man who once commanded an entire country's military, its oil reserves, its courts, its legislature. Think about that. A sitting president reduced to a line item in a federal bounty program. But here's what the headlines won't tell you. This wasn't about oil prices. It wasn't about sanctions alone. It wasn't even really about Maduro himself. The collapse of Venezuela was engineered through something far more insidious, something that happened slowly, then all at once. It was the systematic destruction of trust, of competence, of institutions. The arrest of Maduro isn't the beginning of this story. It's the mathematical conclusion to a decade-long economic autopsy. You see, countries don't just fail. They don't collapse because one thing goes wrong. They collapse because every single system that holds them together gets hollowed out from the inside until there's nothing left but a shell. And when that shell finally cracks, everyone acts surprised. But the math was always there. The spreadsheet was screaming. The only question was when someone would finally run the numbers. Venezuela had the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia, larger than anyone. And yet, by 2020, the country was producing just 337,000 barrels per day. That's less than some small African nations, less than countries without a fraction of Venezuela's reserves. So what happened? Did the oil disappear? Did the ground suddenly stop giving? No, the oil was always there. What disappeared was the ability to extract it, and that didn't happen by accident. This is the story of how a government can destroy its own country not through war, not through invasion, but through a series of deliberate decisions that prioritize power over production, loyalty over competence, and control over survival. This is the story of what happens when the people running the machine don't understand the machine. Or worse, when they understand it perfectly and decide to strip it for parts anyway. So let's start at the moment when Venezuela fired its own brain, because that's when the real collapse began. Part 2. When the state fired its brain. In 2003, something happened in Venezuela that most people outside the country didn't notice. It didn't make international headlines. There were no dramatic images, no explosions, no coups. But what happened that year was arguably more destructive than any military takeover could have been. The Venezuelan government fired approximately 20,000 engineers from PDVSA, the state oil company. 20,000. Not because they were incompetent, not because they were corrupt, but because they went on strike. Because they opposed the government. Now you might think, okay, so they fired some workers. Companies fire people all the time. But these weren't just workers. These were petroleum engineers, geologists, refinery specialists, the people who understood how to extract ultra-heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt. And here's what matters. Ultra-heavy crude isn't like the light sweet crude that flows easily out of the ground in Saudi Arabia. It's thick, it's difficult, it requires constant technical innovation, massive infrastructure investment, and most importantly, specialized expertise. The kind of expertise that takes decades to build. Venezuela replaced those 20,000 engineers with political loyalists, people whose primary qualification wasn't understanding thermodynamics or reservoir engineering. It was loyalty to the party, loyalty to the revolution, and PDVSA, which had been one of the most sophisticated oil companies in the world, was transformed overnight into a political cash machine. The company wasn't treated as an industrial asset anymore. It was treated as a piggy bank, a slush fund, a way to finance social programs, military spending, and of course, corruption. The numbers tell the story. In 2013, Venezuela was producing roughly 3 million barrels per day. By 2020, that number had collapsed to 337,000 barrels per day. That's not a decline. That's a free fall. That's an almost 90% reduction in output. And remember, this is happening in a country sitting on top of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. The oil didn't go anywhere. The people who knew how to get it out did. Here's the thing that economists call resource curse, which is a fancy way of saying that having a lot of natural resources can actually destroy your economy if you're not careful. Because when you have oil, you don't need to build other industries. You don't need to educate your population broadly. You don't need to create a diversified economy. You just pump oil, sell it, and use the money to import everything else. And that works great until it doesn't. Until the price of oil drops. Or until, in Venezuela's case, you fire everyone who knows how to pump the oil in the first place. But even that doesn't fully explain what happened. Because other oil-dependent countries have survived price crashes. Norway has oil. Canada has oil. They didn't collapse. So what made Venezuela different? It was the decision to prioritize ideology over industry, to treat expertise as a threat instead of an asset, to believe that political loyalty could substitute for technical competence. It couldn't. And by the time the government realized that, it was too late. The engineers had left, the infrastructure had decayed, the machinery had broken down, and there was nobody left who knew how to fix it. The oil wells didn't go dry. The country just forgot how to turn the tap. And once you lose that knowledge, once that expertise leaves the country or retires or simply gives up, you can't just get it back. You can't replace decades of accumulated knowledge with a training seminar. You can't rebuild institutional memory with a YouTube tutorial. So Venezuela had reserves. It had more oil than almost anyone on Earth. But it didn't have the one thing it actually needed, the competence to extract it. And that's when the government made its second catastrophic decision. Instead of admitting the problem, instead of trying to rebuild, it decided to print its way out of trouble. And that's where things went from bad to apocalyptic. Part 3. Hyperinflation as national policy. In 2014, global oil prices collapsed. For most oil-producing countries, this was painful but manageable. They tightened their belts. They cut spending. They borrowed. They adjusted. But Venezuela didn't do any of that. Venezuela had a different plan. It decided to print money, and not just a little money. It printed money like it was going out of style, which in a way it was. Here's what happens when a government prints money to cover its spending instead of raising taxes or cutting programs. Inflation. Prices go up. That's basic economics. But what happened in Venezuela wasn't basic inflation. It was hyperinflation. The kind of inflation that doesn't just make things more expensive, the kind that makes money itself worthless. In 2018, Venezuela's inflation rate hit 130,000%. 130,000? That's not a typo. By early 2019, it had climbed past 300,000%. Let me put that in perspective. Imagine you have $1,000 in your bank account. In a normal economy with 2 or 3% inflation, that $1,000 loses a little bit of purchasing power each year. Maybe after a year, it buys you what $970 would have bought you the year before. Annoying, but manageable. In Venezuela, that $1,000 would be worth essentially zero within weeks. Not months. Weeks. The Venezuelan bolivar became so worthless that people started using it for art projects. They'd weave purses out of bolivar notes because the paper was more valuable than the currency printed on it. Think about that. The physical material of the money was worth more than the money itself. That's not just economic collapse. That's the complete evaporation of trust in the state's ability to maintain a functioning currency. So what did people do? They abandoned the bolivar. They started using dollars, US dollars, euros, anything that held value. And the government, because it had no other choice, eventually legalized dollarization. But here's the cruel joke. Not everyone had access to dollars. So Venezuela split into two economies, a two-tier survival system. At the top, roughly 5% of the population, the regime elites, the people connected to the government. They shopped at fancy stores called bodegons. These were high-end shops stocked with imported goods, champagne, electronics, fresh produce, all priced in dollars, all accessible only to those with hard currency. The people who benefited from corruption, from smuggling, from their connections to the regime. And then there was everyone else. 95% of the population trapped in what can only be described as a zombie economy. They earned worthless bolivars. They couldn't afford basic goods. They stood in line for hours hoping to buy subsidized food if there was any. They watched as their savings evaporated, as their pensions became meaningless, as their labor became worthless. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of tough economic times. This was policy. When you print money to avoid making hard decisions, when you refuse to cut spending because it might hurt your political support, when you prioritize staying in power over maintaining a functional economy, this is what happens. The currency dies, and when the currency dies, everything else follows. But the government didn't just print money and hope for the best. It found another way to maintain control. It turned starvation into a business model, and that's where things get even darker. Part 4. Starvation turned into a business model. By 2016, Venezuela had entered what some people darkly called the Maduro diet. It wasn't a choice. It was a statistical reality. A national survey found that 75% of Venezuelans had lost an average of 19 pounds, not from exercising, not from healthy eating, from skipping meals, from not having enough food, from malnutrition. Let that sink in for a moment. 3 out of 4 people in a country lost nearly 20 pounds because they couldn't eat enough. That's not poverty. That's systemic starvation. And it was happening in a country that just a decade earlier had been wealthy enough to subsidize gas prices so heavily that filling a tank cost less than buying a candy bar. But here's where it gets truly sinister. The government didn't try to solve the food crisis. Instead, it weaponized it. In 2016, the Maduro regime launched something called CLAP, which stands for Local Supply and Production Committees. On paper, CLAP was a food distribution program. The government would deliver boxes of basic goods, rice, flour, cooking oil, to families every month. Sounds helpful, right? Like a social safety net. Except CLAP wasn't designed to help everyone. It was designed to control everyone. The food boxes were distributed based on political loyalty. If you supported the government, if you showed up to rallies, if you voted the right way, you got your box. If you dissented, if you protested, if you criticized the regime, your box didn't show up. Starvation became a compliance mechanism. Hunger became leverage, and it wasn't even good food. The CLAP boxes were filled with low-quality products, often expired or nearly expired, imported at inflated prices by companies with ties to the regime. The government was paying premium prices for substandard food, which created massive opportunities for corruption. Middlemen made fortunes, shell companies collected contracts, and the food that actually reached people was barely edible. This is what economists call rent-seeking, which is a bloodless way of saying that people were profiting from scarcity instead of solving it. The government wasn't importing food to feed people. It was importing food to enrich loyalists and maintain political control. Scarcity wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a tool to be exploited. Think about the incentive structure this creates. If you're a government official and your power depends on people needing you for food, what's your incentive to make food more available? If ending the food crisis means people don't need you anymore, why would you end it? You wouldn't. You'd perpetuate it. You'd manage it. You'd use it. This is how states fail, not through dramatic revolutions or foreign invasions, through the slow, deliberate transformation of every system into a mechanism of control. Food becomes political, medicine becomes political, electricity becomes political, and that's exactly what happened next. Because while Venezuela was starving, it was also going dark. Part 5. Blackouts, sewage water, and the mining free-for-all. On March 7th, 2019, Venezuela went dark. Not just Caracas, not just a few neighborhoods, the entire country. A nationwide blackout that lasted nearly a week. The cause? The Guri Dam, which provides roughly 70% of Venezuela's electricity, failed. The government blamed sabotage, blamed the United States, blamed opposition groups. But the reality was simpler and more damning. Decades of neglect and incompetence. When the power grid fails for a week, society doesn't just inconvenience itself. It unravels. Hospitals lost power. Incubators stopped working. Dialysis machines shut down. People died. Not from violence, not from disease, from the simple absence of electricity. Refrigerators stopped working, so food rotted. Water pumps stopped, so people fetched water from rivers. Rivers contaminated with sewage, because the water treatment plants also had no power. People were drinking contaminated water because the state couldn't keep the lights on. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was state collapse in real time. The infrastructure that keeps a modern society functioning had been allowed to decay for so long that it simply gave out. And the government had no ability to fix it because, remember, they'd fired or driven away everyone with technical expertise years earlier. The engineers who could have prevented this were gone. The maintenance budgets that could have kept the system running had been looted. And now, millions of people were sitting in the dark drinking sewage water and waiting for a government that could barely function to somehow restore power. But while the country was collapsing, the regime found a new revenue stream. If you can't pump oil anymore, if you can't run a functioning economy, what do? You pivot to crime. In 2016, Maduro opened up the Orinoco mining arc, an area covering roughly 12% of Venezuela's national territory. The government claimed this was about economic development, about mining gold and other minerals legally. But what actually happened was that the military and Colombian guerrilla groups, particularly the ELN, took control of illegal gold extraction operations. The Venezuelan military wasn't protecting the country anymore. It was running criminal enterprises, and they had a name for this network, the Cartel of the Suns. High-ranking military officers, some wearing uniforms with sun insignia on their shoulders, became logistics coordinators for cocaine trafficking. The Venezuelan state wasn't fighting drug cartels. It had become one. Gold extracted illegally from the Orinoco region was smuggled out and sold. Cocaine from Colombia was transshipped through Venezuela to international markets. The state, which could no longer provide electricity or food or clean water, had successfully transformed itself into a criminal logistics operation. And this wasn't some rogue element. This was policy. This was how the regime stayed funded when the oil money ran out. Think about what this means. A government that can't keep the lights on can still coordinate international drug trafficking. A state that can't deliver food boxes can still manage illegal gold mining. That tells you something about priorities. That tells you what the government actually valued, and it wasn't the people. But even crime has its limits. Even drug trafficking and illegal mining can only generate so much revenue. And by January 2026, the math finally caught up. The loot ran out, and that's when everything truly ended. Part 6. When loot runs out. By January 2026, Venezuela's GDP had collapsed by roughly 80% from its peak. 80%. That's not a recession. That's not a depression. That's one of the worst peacetime economic contractions in modern history. To put that in perspective, the United States during the Great Depression saw GDP decline by about 25 to 30%. Venezuela's collapse was more than twice as severe, and it happened in a country with the largest oil reserves on Earth. But GDP numbers don't capture the human cost. Between 7.7 and 8 million Venezuelans fled the country. That's roughly a quarter of the population. And these weren't just random people. They were doctors, engineers, teachers, skilled workers, the exact people a country needs to rebuild. They left because there was nothing left to stay for. No jobs, no opportunities, no future, just darkness, hunger, and a government that had long since stopped pretending to govern. And here's the thing. When that many skilled people leave, they don't come back. Even if things improve, even if a new government takes over, that lost generation is gone. The brain drain isn't reversible. The institutional knowledge is lost. The social fabric is torn. And rebuilding becomes exponentially harder. So when Maduro was extracted from that military base in Caracas and flown to New York, when he was detained at MDC Brooklyn, it wasn't about justice. Not really. It was about math. By January 2026, protecting Maduro was no longer profitable. The incentive structure had flipped. Military officers and regime loyalists looked around and realized that plea deals with international prosecutors were worth more than loyalty to a leader who had nothing left to offer. The loot had run out, and when the loot runs out, so does loyalty. Maduro's arrest wasn't the cause of Venezuela's collapse. It was the final line item on the balance sheet, the closing entry in a decade-long ledger of destruction. And that ledger tells a story that goes far beyond oil prices or sanctions or any single policy decision. It's a story about what happens when a government systematically destroys every institution that makes a country function. Venezuela's collapse didn't come from oil. Oil was just the resource that could have saved it if the institutions had been competent. The collapse came from institutional vandalism, from replacing competence with loyalty, from printing money instead of doing math, from corruption replacing production, from fear replacing food, from crime replacing government. This is the autopsy. The patient died from multiple organ failure. The heart was the purge of PDVSA engineers in 2003. The lungs were the hyperinflation that suffocated the currency. The liver was the corruption that turned food distribution into a political weapon. The kidneys were the infrastructure collapse that left people in the dark. And the brain? The brain was destroyed the moment the government decided that ideology mattered more than expertise. Countries don't collapse because one thing goes wrong. They collapse because every system fails simultaneously, because every institution is hollowed out, because every competent person either leaves or is driven away, because the people in power prioritize staying in power over keeping the country alive. And when that happens, math takes over. The spreadsheet doesn't care about revolutionary rhetoric, it doesn't care about political ideology, it just adds up the numbers. And in Venezuela, those numbers went to zero. The world will call this a tragedy. Politicians will give speeches, aid organizations will appeal for donations, and somewhere, economists will write papers about what went wrong. But on the spreadsheet, it was simply the bill coming due. Venezuela spent decades writing checks its competence couldn't cash. It borrowed against a future it was actively destroying, and eventually, inevitably, the creditors came calling. Maduro sitting in a cell in Brooklyn isn't the end of the story. It's just the most visible consequence of decisions made years, decades earlier. Decisions to fire engineers instead of listening to them. Decisions to print money instead of facing reality. Decisions to weaponize hunger instead of solving it. Decisions to profit from collapse instead of preventing it. And here's the warning for the rest of us. This can happen anywhere. Venezuela wasn't uniquely cursed. It wasn't doomed by geography or history or culture. It was destroyed by choices, by leaders who valued power over competence, by systems that rewarded loyalty over expertise, by incentives that made corruption more profitable than production. And every one of those choices is available to every government on earth. When a government destroys trust, the currency dies first, then the economy dies, then the people leave, and finally the state itself collapses. That's not a metaphor. That's the sequence. That's what the Venezuelan autopsy shows. And the scariest part, the patient was still alive when the damage became irreversible. There were moments when different choices could have changed the trajectory, but those moments passed. Those choices weren't made, and the country died anyway. So when you hear about Venezuela, when you see the headlines about Maduro's arrest, don't think about oil prices. Think about what happens when competence becomes a liability instead of an asset. Think about what happens when printing money becomes easier than facing hard truths. Think about what happens when fear and hunger become tools of control instead of problems to solve. Think about the math, because the math always wins. And in Venezuela, the math was screaming for years before anyone was listening. By the time they heard it, there was nothing left to save.